There was a dog that hadn't moved for 3 weeks at the county shelter. He didn't bark. He didn't eat when people watched. And he didn't respond to a single command, not even the ones he'd once obeyed without hesitation, wearing a K9 badge on his collar. They called him Titan, a soldier who no longer fought, a soul stranded between memory and silence. And then, one quiet autumn afternoon, a 78-year-old man walked into that shelter. His name was Walt Henley, the kind of man the town had almost forgotten. A recluse, a veteran, someone who'd lost more than he ever admitted. He stood by the kennel. And Titan, for the first time in nearly a month, stood up. No one understood what happened in that moment. There were no words, just a look, a silent agreement between two beings who both stopped expecting to be seen. But this isn't just a story about a dog who finally listened again. And it's not just about an old man and the son he couldn't save. This is a story of loss, of memory left unopened in drawers, of how a dog, without a single word, brought a man back to life. You won't forget Titan by the end of this story, because sometimes the strongest steps are the ones you never hear. The red brick kennel at the far end of the county rescue center had never been so quiet. Every morning, the other dogs would bark and whine and jump at their gates, some full of hope, some just desperate for someone to notice them. But kennel number 7 stayed silent. Always. That's where Titan was. Titan didn't bark, didn't move, didn't eat if anyone was watching. He simply lay in the far corner, head resting between his front paws, as still as a statue, as though he'd been carved there by grief itself. His eyes were open but empty, like he'd watched the world end and decided not to follow it anymore. Sheila, the older woman who managed the shelter, told people Titan wasn't like the others. He had served in AK-9 unit, search and rescue, narcotics, even bomb detection. The kind of dog who could leap into helicopters and run into gunfire without hesitation. But ever since his handler had died, an officer lost in a nighttime border patrol, Titan hadn't responded to a single voice, not a single command, not even to the familiar cues he had been trained to obey. Some said he was grieving. Others whispered that he was broken. On the 4th Wednesday of October, when the wind carried that dry, dusty cold only Montana knows, the bell above the shelter door gave a soft chime. Sheila looked up, not expecting much. The man standing there wore an old Navy peacoat and a faded knit cap. He leaned on a cane. His eyes, gray-blue like a frozen lake, scanned the room slowly, as if looking for something that didn't want to be found. "You looking for someone?" Sheila asked gently. The man paused, like he was sorting through a drawer full of dusty memories. "I heard there's a dog here, one that doesn't get up for anyone." She nodded. "Titan, but he's not your average dog. He's been through something, and, well, he doesn't let anyone in." "That's all right," the man said, his voice quiet. "Neither do I." Sheila led him down the hallway. His cane clicked steadily against the linoleum, matching the slow rhythm of a man who wasn't in a rush for anything anymore. When they reached Kennel 7, she motioned him forward. "You can try, but don't get your hopes up." He didn't answer, just stood at the doorway, eyes on the still form in the corner. Then, slowly, almost painfully, he knelt down beside the entrance. He didn't speak, didn't call the dog, just sat there, one hand resting on his knee, the other holding onto the cane like it was more than just wood. Minutes passed. Titan didn't move. Sheila was about to gently say it was time to go when it happened. Titan lifted his head. It was slight but unmistakable. The dog turned and looked at the man, really looked, not just glanced, not with suspicion or hope, but with recognition, like he was seeing something he hadn't seen in a long time, something that once mattered. The man didn't smile. He didn't speak. Titan stood. He rose slow, deliberate, like an old soldier, and padded across the kennel. When he reached the gate, he didn't bark or whimper. He just laid down again, right at the threshold, his eyes never leaving the man kneeling there. "My God," Sheila whispered, stepping closer. "He's never done that for anyone." The man finally spoke, his voice more breath than sound. "I think we understand each other." His name was Walt Henley. He was 78, a widower, a retired mechanic, and before that, a Marine. He lived alone in a small wood cabin by the edge of Glacier Forest, with no visitors and no mailbox. The locals said he'd once had a son who went to war and never came back. But no one asked. Walt didn't talk about it, and the silence around his house grew thicker with every year. When Sheila asked if he was sure he wanted to take Titan, Walt didn't hesitate. 3 days later, he returned with a leather leash, so worn it looked like it had stories of its own. In his pocket was an old brass tag from a collar that once belonged to a dog his son wrote about in a letter he'd never opened. Until now. "I know you don't take orders anymore," he said as he opened the truck door, "but maybe you still listen when it counts." Titan stepped into the truck without being told. As they drove, the road curled like a ribbon through tall pines and golden hills, past hay bales left out in fading autumn light. Walt didn't say a word. Neither did Titan. But the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was familiar, as if both had carried the same kind of emptiness inside and were relieved, finally, not to carry it alone. Walt glanced at Titan in the rearview mirror once. Just once, and the dog was watching him, not warily, but quietly, like he was trying to remember something, or maybe recognize it. The cabin came into view, nestled behind a line of wind-worn trees, where birds didn't bother to sing anymore, and the porch creaked from age, not footsteps. Walt parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, fingers still on the wheel. "You can get out if you want," he said, eyes still forward. "Or don't. I won't blame you either way." Titan leapt down. No leash, no command, just faith. Inside the house, everything smelled of pine and wood smoke. The floor creaked like it always had. The photo of Walt's son still hung crooked above the fireplace. Titan circled the room once, then lay down beside the armchair like he'd always belonged there. Walt sat across from him, poured himself some tea, and said nothing. He didn't need to. Outside, a wind picked up, gentle, rustling through dry leaves clinging to their last days. The sky turned to soft blue-gray, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried once, sharp and high. It was the kind of silence that doesn't ask for anything, only the beginning of something neither of them had expected, a quiet return to life. There was no sudden shift, no thunderclap revelation, just the sound of a kettle hissing softly on a stove one cold morning, and a German Shepherd quietly padding into the kitchen to lie down near the door, as if he'd always done so. There was something beautiful about how quietly Titan moved, without drama, without need for praise, like a ghost but alive, like someone who didn't want to disturb what wasn't his. Walt noticed, not with a smile or a spoken word, but with a subtle nod, the kind you give to an old friend you haven't seen in years. The kind that means, "I see you, I remember." The cabin hadn't changed much in the last decade. The armchair still sagged on one side, the one that had always been his. The fireplace was mostly ornamental now, used only in December when the electricity flickered and Walt couldn't stand the sound of his own breath. The calendar on the wall was 3 months old. August. His son's birthday had come and gone, and Walt had ignored it the way he did every year, by watching the sky change and not answering the phone. He wasn't sure if Titan noticed these things, but he acted like he did. He didn't invade Walt's space. He didn't bark or whimper or nudge his nose into Walt's lap like dogs in movies. Instead, Titan lingered nearby. Just nearby. Enough to be noticed, never enough to demand. At night, Walt would make a single cup of tea, sit by the window, and pretend not to be waiting for anything. Titan would lie at the threshold of the room, eyes half closed, still and silent, except when the wind blew too hard or when a certain owl cried in the woods behind the house. Then Titan would lift his head, ears angled, like he was remembering something long buried. Walt understood that feeling. There were stories he hadn't told anyone, like how, the day his son shipped out, they'd argued about a letter. The letter Walt never read because he was too angry at the time. The letter that came in the mail 6 months later, sealed with a rubber band and creased in one corner, sitting in a drawer ever since. It was strange, the way grief twisted time. It could make 20 years feel like yesterday, and 5 minutes feel like a decade. Walt sometimes wondered if maybe, deep down, he had been waiting for someone to show up and ask him to open that drawer. Someone who wouldn't push, wouldn't ask questions, wouldn't expect an explanation. Just sit there. Titan didn't ask for stories. But he was one. One morning, Walt took him out into the woods behind the cabin. The air was brittle, touched with frost. Leaves crackled underfoot, brittle as paper. Titan walked beside him with a kind of alertness that didn't scream for attention. He didn't tug on the leash. There wasn't one. He didn't need it. Walt paused at a stump halfway up the trail and sat down. His knees weren't what they used to be. He watched Titan sniff at the base of a pine, then moved toward a hollow where deer sometimes passed. "You don't talk much," Walt muttered, more to himself than to the dog. "But I guess neither do I." Titan looked at him for a long time. Not wagging, not panting, just looking. "What do you think?" Walt asked softly. "We're both too old for this." Titan stepped closer and sat beside him, and that, strangely, felt like an answer. Over the next few weeks, Walt fell into a rhythm he hadn't expected. He woke earlier, cooked eggs, sometimes even ate them. He fixed the broken hinge on the back screen door, cleaned the dust off the window ledge in his son's old room, not because he had plans to use it, but because he could. Titan was part of everything and nothing. He didn't follow Walt from room to room, but he was always in view. On rainy days, he would curl beside the heater vent, paws tucked beneath him like a sphinx. On dry ones, he'd wait by the porch until Walt brought out the old folding chair and sat beside him. They'd both watch the horizon without saying anything, as if they knew that staring long enough might bring someone back. A neighbor stopped by once, uninvited, offering baked goods. She was polite, middle-aged, wore earrings that jingled when she moved. "I heard you took in that dog from the shelter," she said, placing a tin on the step. Walt nodded. "They said he wouldn't respond to anyone. But you got through to him?" "I didn't," Walt said simply. "He just let me sit near him." The woman chuckled. "Well, he sure picked the right porch." Walt didn't answer, because what he wanted to say was, "I think he picked the only one where silence feels like home." That night, Walt stood by the small dresser where the unopened letter sat. He stared at it for a long time, his hand resting on the drawer handle. Titan walked into the room behind him, his steps so quiet they didn't interrupt the moment. Walt didn't open the drawer. Not yet, but he sat down, and Titan lay beside him. When the wind howled that night, rattling the eaves and pushing against the windows, Walt didn't light the fire. He just sat in the armchair with a blanket over his legs, listening to the wind, to his breathing, to the soft rhythm of Titan's tail sweeping the wooden floor once, then again. There's something sacred in being known without speaking, in being allowed to feel everything and nothing at once, in sharing space with a creature who doesn't judge how long it's been since you said the name of the one you lost. In the stillness of that cabin, silence wasn't absence. It wasn't void. It was language, and both of them, man and dog, were fluent in it. The first snow of the season didn't arrive with ceremony. It simply fell, soft, steady, like a blanket placed gently over the shoulders of the world. Walt Henley had been chopping firewood when he noticed it. Tiny flakes brushing against his coat sleeves, melting on the brim of his navy cap. Titan stood a few feet away, his dark coat speckled white, watching the sky as if listening to a language only he remembered. Walt wiped his hands and leaned on the axe handle, breathing into the cold air. He watched as the snow dusted the ground, smoothing out its edges, hiding what was broken beneath what looked clean and quiet. "Guess winter's really here," he murmured. Titan didn't flinch. His ears twitched, but his body remained still, steady, like the old oak tree near the porch, weathered but rooted. That night, Walt built a fire on the hearth for the first time in nearly a year. The flicker of light danced along the wooden walls, and Titan lay stretched out before it, his long body relaxed but alert. Walt sipped tea from a mug with the chipped rim, the one his son had given him the Christmas before deployment. A part of him had wanted to throw it away more than once, but he didn't. Maybe he couldn't. The next morning, the world outside the cabin had turned white. The forest, usually full of shadows and brown undergrowth, was now a canvas of silence. Walt pulled on his old boots, stiff from disuse, and opened the door. "Come on, boy," he said. Titan stepped out first, his paws pressing perfect imprints into the snow, each one deep and deliberate. Walt followed, slower. The cold bit through his knees, but he didn't mind, not as much as he used to, not with Titan walking ahead of him like he had somewhere important to lead them. The plan was simple: walk to the ridge and back, clear the mind, move the joints, feel the cold for what it was, real, sharp, alive. But halfway through the trail, Walt's boot slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. His cane skidded sideways. The world tilted. He fell hard. Pain shot through his hip, white-hot and immediate. He tried to move, but the cold caught up to him faster than his breath could recover. He lay still, snow seeping into the back of his coat, his teeth clenching as he let out a long, slow groan. "Damn it," he hissed. Titan was there before the sound even finished leaving Walt's mouth. The dog hovered, circling once, then twice. He nudged Walt's shoulder gently, almost delicately. When Walt tried to sit up, pain stopped him. "Not good," he muttered, half to himself, half to the dog. Titan took a step back and sat, ears alert, watching the trail ahead. Then he stood and vanished into the trees. Panic flickered in Walt's chest. Not fear of death, but the bitter taste of being left. Again, just like before, just like always. But 10 minutes later, Titan returned. With him, a small branch, thick, sturdy, dragged along by his teeth like it was a prize. Walt stared. "You're kidding me," he said. Titan dropped it beside him, then nudged it forward with his nose. Walt, baffled but not ready to argue with a dog who clearly had more of a plan than he did, reached for it. He braced against the branch and began to sit up slowly, using it like a makeshift cane. Titan moved closer, steadying his side under Walt's arm, bracing like a living support. It was slow going. Every step felt like climbing a mountain backward. But Titan didn't rush. He moved with him, patient, deliberate. Each time Walt faltered, the dog was there. Not pulling, not panicking. Just present. They made it back to the cabin as the light began to turn blue, the color of dusk on snow, soft and cold. Walt collapsed into his chair, breath heaving, hips screaming. Titan lay at his feet, eyes on the door, as if guarding him from the very idea of winter itself. Later that evening, Walt lit another fire and sat quietly, a blanket over his lap, pain medication barely taking the edge off. Titan's breathing was steady. Walt watched the flame flicker against the log, thinking of all the times he prepared for storms, stocked food, braced windows, always for himself. No one had ever braced for him, except maybe now a dog had. That thought alone made something uncoil in his chest. The next day, Sheila showed up unexpectedly. One of the volunteers had heard about Walt's fall. Small-town word-of-mouth traveled faster than radio. She brought groceries and a heavy-duty heating pad, but paused when she saw Titan waiting by the door like a soldier at post. "I heard he saved you," she said, stepping inside. Walt grunted. "If saving me includes dragging a stick and not letting me die in the snow, then yeah, guess he did." She smiled. "He was trained for search and rescue, you know. High-level unit. Dogs like him don't just forget. They choose when to remember." Walt looked at Titan. The dog didn't react, just continued to stare out at the woods, ever vigilant. "Funny," Walt said, his voice quiet. "I didn't choose to remember anything, but somehow, being around him, it's like my own memories are starting to knock again." Sheila nodded, her expression soft. Sometimes the ones who've seen the worst in life are the only ones who can sit with your pain without trying to fix it. Before she left, she handed him a manila envelope. "Found this in Titan's file. Thought maybe you should have it." Walt didn't open it right away. He placed it on the mantel, next to the old photo of his son in uniform, the one taken 2 months before he deployed. That night, snow fell again. Thicker, wilder, the kind that howled through trees and blurred the edges of the world. But inside the cabin, the fire crackled and warmth lingered. Titan didn't sleep by the door. Instead, he lay beside Walt's chair, head resting on the old man's foot. Walt reached down, fingers brushing soft fur. You remembered what to do when it mattered, he whispered. Guess that makes one of us. Titan's tail moved once. A quiet thump against the floor. It was enough. Outside, the storm continued. But inside, for the first time in years, Walt didn't feel like he was bracing alone. The first time Walt Henley heard the sirens, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him. Out there, tucked deep in the woods at the edge of town, sound usually came softly. Wind in the trees, the crack of ice as it thawed at noon, the occasional low call of a mourning dove. But this sound was sharp, urgent, a rising wail slicing to the cold evening like a knife through silk. Titan was already at the door, his body tense, his ears up, his tail stiff still. Walt set his tea down and leaned forward in the armchair. The fire had burned low, and the room flickered in restless shadows. The sky outside the window was blackening faster than it should have. Heavy clouds dragged across the moon. Something was wrong. He stood, his knees protesting, and walked the porch. From there, the sound was clearer, sirens echoing in the distance. Then headlights flashed through the tree line. A town rescue truck pulled up fast, tires skidding on snow-packed dirt. 2 volunteers climbed out, young, breathless. Mr. Henley, one of them called, her voice sharp with concern. Have you seen any signs of the missing group? Walt narrowed his eyes. Missing? A group of kids and a volunteer leader, she said, adjusting her scarf. They were on a weekend camp out past Big Elk Creek. Storm rolled in early. They were supposed to check in 3 hours ago. Phones are down. Walt looked up toward the ridge. That stretch of land beyond the creek, rocky, winding, and cruel in winter, wasn't something you wandered in after dark. Not unless you were ready for what nature could do to a person, or unless you had no choice. The volunteer hesitated. We know this is your side of the woods, and we were wondering. I'll get my coat, Walt said. Inside, Titan was already pacing. Walt didn't even have to call him. He pulled on his heavy jacket, slid his feet into boots that had molded to the shape of his life, and reached for the flashlight by the door. The wind had picked up, not a howl, but a low groan, like the earth was unsettled. You still got it in you, old boy? Walt asked, glancing down. Titan didn't answer. He didn't need to. His body already faced the trees. The trail was disappearing by the minute. Snow was coming fast and sideways, blinding, disorienting. Even Walt, who knew every rise and hollow of that forest like he knew the lines in his palms, had to stop and reorient himself more than once. But Titan didn't pause. He sniffed the air, nose low, ears twitching like radar. And then he moved, not randomly, but with purpose, following something Walt couldn't see. Go on, Walt said, teeth clenched against the cold. Show me. Titan broke into a trot. They climbed the old game trail, crossed frozen creeks, ducked under low-hanging pine branches weighed heavy with snow. The flashlight beam caught nothing but white and branches, but Walt could feel it. Something pulling him forward. Something real. He remembered the manila envelope Sheila had given him days ago. Still unopened, still resting on the mantel. Part of him had been afraid. Afraid of what his son might have written. Afraid of facing the last words of someone who never came home. But another part, smaller then, stronger now, knew that letter wasn't just paper. It was a key, and Titan might just be the door it unlocked. Please, he whispered, not even sure who he was talking to. His son, the night, the dog ahead of him. Let them be alive. Up ahead, Titan barked once. Sharp, focused. Walt pushed forward, stumbling slightly. He reached the edge of a clearing, where the wind dipped strangely. Titan stood frozen. His nose pointed toward a jagged cut of rock, and a narrow trail barely visible beneath the snow. Walt recognized it. An old shortcut. Dangerous, but faster. And kids, being kids, might have thought it was an adventure. Lead the way, he said. Titan lowered his body, sending again, then took off at a brisk, deliberate pace. It wasn't long before Walt saw the first sign, half-covered footprints. Then a torn corner of a trail map caught on a bush. Then silence. The wind had stopped. The air was heavy. like holding your breath in a church before the music starts. Titan slowed, nose to the ground. He veered left, then right, then barked again, 2 short bursts. Walt caught up, gasping. And there they were, huddled under a shelf of rock, wrapped in sleeping bags, were 4 kids and 1 young adult. A volunteer no older than 20. Their faces were pale, lips cracked. One of the younger girls wasn't moving. She's breathing. The leader croaked, voice hoarse. But barely. We got lost. Phones died. We ran out of heat. Walt knelt down, pulled off his gloves, and gently touched the girl's cheek. Cold. Too cold. Get the others to safety, he told the volunteer. I'll carry her. She's heavy. I said I've got her. Titan stood over the girl as Walt wrapped her in his coat. The dog's body trembled, not with cold, but with readiness. His eyes met Walt's, and something passed between them, something without words. The trek back was slower, more careful. The storm hadn't let up, but Walt didn't care. Titan stayed close, guiding them, nudging the trail where it vanished, standing watch when they paused. Not just a dog, not just a companion, a sentinel. By the time the rescue team met them halfway down the trail, headlights slicing through snow and sirens muffled by wind, Walt was nearly out of breath. But he didn't stop, not until he placed the girl into the arms of the EMT and stepped back, sweat freezing on his brow. She's going to be okay, someone said. Walt didn't answer. He turned to Titan, dropped to one knee, and looked at him in a way he hadn't looked at anyone in years. Thank you, he whispered. Titan pressed his head against Walt's chest. It was the first time Walt cried in front of another living soul since the flag was folded and handed to him 2 decades ago. And Titan didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there and held him up. The morning after the storm broke, the town awoke to a rare hush. Trees stood heavy with ice-glazed snow. Fences wore white coats. Even the birds, usually eager to declare dawn, remained quiet, as if the world was still holding its breath after what could have been a tragedy. The children had survived. All of them. The little girl with the blue lips was now sitting up in a hospital bed, holding hot cocoa with both hands. Her mother cried when she saw her, repeating thank yous between sobs that made her shoulders shake. No one asked how she'd made it through the night under the rock shelf, but they remembered the man who'd carried her, and the dog that led him. Walt Henley didn't stick around for thanks. He and Titan slipped away before sunrise, before cameras, before local reporters could find a quote or a headline. That kind of attention made Walt uncomfortable. His world had always been built quietly, one repaired engine at a time, one silent walk in the woods, one memory too sharp to name. He didn't need applause. He never had. But later that afternoon, someone did show up at his porch. It was a young man in uniform, not military, but police. Tan jacket, clean boots, and eyes that carried the kind of reverence you don't get from reading a report. His name was Officer Clay Benton. He held something wrapped in an old cloth and stood with a kind of practiced stillness, like someone raised to be respectful in a world that often wasn't. "You're Mr. Henley?" he asked. Walt nodded, leaning against the doorframe, Titan sitting just behind him, half in shadow. "I was asked to bring this to you," Clay said, unwrapping the cloth. Inside was a small brass badge, oval-shaped, worn at the edges, the letters slightly rubbed but still legible. K9 Unit 14 Handler, CPL J. Henley, and beneath that, a second, smaller engraving, one Walt hadn't seen before. Dog's name, Titan. Walt's fingers didn't reach for it at first. They simply hovered above it, like touching it might cause something fragile in him to crack open. "That badge belonged to your son," Clay said quietly. "It was part of his personal effects, stored with the unit archives. When we saw the name on the file and the report from last night, well, we realized the connection." Walt said nothing. Clay continued, a little more gently. "Your son trained Titan. From day one, they were deployed together. Border patrol, natural disaster zones. It's rare. Handlers rotate out all the time, but your son and Titan were a bonded pair. No reassignment ever stuck. They wouldn't separate." Walt cleared his throat. "They didn't tell me that. I imagine they didn't know how." Clay replied. The porch creaked beneath Walt's shifting weight. A wind passed through the trees. Titan looked up at the sound but didn't move. His body stayed still, loyal and waiting. We also found something else, Clay said, pulling a folder from his satchel. A copy of your son's final letter. One that never made it home. We believe he wrote it the day before the incident. Walt hesitated, then nodded. Clay handed him the letter, its paper slightly yellowed, the edges worn from time. Walt didn't open it right away. He simply held it, thumb brushing the fold, as if trying to remember how it felt to receive something from his son. It had been too long. I'll leave you to it, Clay said. But before I go, I think Titan already knew. Walt looked up. I think he remembered you, Clay said, somewhere deep down. Maybe not with words, but with something older. Walt didn't respond. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes had changed, ever so slightly. He watched the patrol car disappear down the road, then sat on the porch steps, letter in hand. Titan came closer, not touching him, just present, as always. The letter shook as he opened it. Dad, I don't know if this will reach you, but I want to believe it will. I know we didn't part on the best terms. We said things we shouldn't have. I held on to anger I didn't understand, and you held on to silence. We're alike in ways I never admitted, and now I'm afraid it's too late. But I want you to know something. I found something here. Not medals or glory. Not the brotherhood they talk about in recruitment videos. I found Titan. And somehow, in working with him, I learned more about you than I ever did growing up. You always said some things didn't need words. He taught me what that meant. He listens like you do, quiet, steady, patient. And when he acts, it's with certainty, never show. He trusts without demanding, loves without announcing. He reminds me of you, Dad, in the best ways. If anything ever happens to me, and Titan makes it home, take care of him. He'll take care of you, too. I promise. Love, James. Walt finished the letter with tears in his eyes. Real, unhidden tears. They didn't fall fast or loud. They simply gathered and slid down his weathered cheeks like meltwater in spring, slow and certain. Titan nudged his knee with his nose. Walt looked down at him. You knew all along, didn't you? Titan pressed closer. Walt reached for the badge, turned it over in his palm. The brass caught the afternoon sun, the letters casting soft shadows against the skin. He thought of the boy James once was, the man he became, and the dog who had carried a piece of him through all the years between. You're not just his dog, Walt whispered. You're his last message. That night, Walt didn't sit in his usual armchair. He sat on the floor beside Titan, the badge resting on the coffee table, the letter folded neatly in his breast pocket. The fire crackled. Snow melted from the rooftop in soft drops. And for the first time in decades, Walt spoke aloud into the quiet. I'm proud of you, James. I always was. Titan didn't move, but his breathing slowed. And for once, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full. The days that followed passed in a kind of reverent stillness. Walt Henley, for the first time in years, kept the curtains open during the day. Not wide, just enough for the sun to find the worn floorboards and dusted photos along the mantel. The badge that had once belonged to his son remained there now, resting beside a small ceramic bowl of matches. He hadn't polished it. The faint scratches and dull brass seemed to hold more truth that way, like it had been lived in, like grief had touched it and moved on. Titan, as always, kept his place near the hearth. But now, something about his presence felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but whole, as if some internal tether had been reconnected. His gaze was less searching, his movement less guarded. He still didn't bark. He didn't need to. People in town started whispering about the story. The children rescued from the storm. The old man who had carried the youngest one through ice and wind. The German Shepherd that led them all home. A few wanted interviews. A reporter called twice and even mailed a handwritten note, one of those rare gestures that almost made Walt consider replying. But in the end, he didn't. What mattered had already been said, in a letter, in silence, in the snow. Instead, Walt opened the drawer in the hallway, the one that had been stuck for years, swollen with age and neglect. Inside were pieces of life paused, yellowing photographs, a pair of socks still in plastic, a notebook with mechanical sketches in his son's handwriting. He found an old photo from a camping trip, James, no more than 12, holding a stick like a sword, grinning with his front tooth missing. Walt stared at it for a long time, then placed it on the mantel next to the badge. That afternoon, Walt walked out back to the shed behind the cabin. Titan followed close behind. The shed had once been a workspace for engines, radios, things that hummed and sparked, but it had long since turned into a storage graveyard. Boxes of screws, rusted saws, broken memories. Walt spent the next few hours clearing it out. Not everything, just enough. He replaced a cracked window pane, swept the corners, and laid down an old rug by the wall where the sun hit in the morning. It wasn't for him. It was for Titan. The dog seemed to understand. He stepped inside when invited, made a slow lap around the space, then curled down in the warmest patch of light and closed his eyes. That night, Walt made soup. Not canned, not reheated. From scratch. He chopped onions with shaky hands, boiled broth on the stove, and added time that had somehow survived in the frostbitten garden box. The scent drifted to the cabin like music, soft and warm. He even pulled a second bowl from the cupboard and filled it with cooked meat for Titan. They ate together. No clinking of cutlery. No words. Just a shared rhythm of companionship. Earned the hard way. The next morning, a package arrived. Walt rarely got mail. The few letters he did receive were usually catalogs he hadn't asked for. But this box was different. Small, plain, wrapped in brown paper with a return address from the K9 Veterans Foundation. Inside, folded neatly between soft cloth, was a plaque. It read, "In memory of Corporal James Henley and K9 Titan. For service, for loyalty, for the lives you changed." Walt stared at it, fingers tracing the engraving. He took a long breath, one that seemed to travel down to parts of himself he'd long forgotten. Then, without hesitation, he walked the front porch and mounted it above the cabin door. Later that week, Sheila came by. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps, holding a clipboard in one hand and a mug of something steaming in the other. "I hope this isn't too forward," she said. "But some folks in town were wondering if you consider something." Walt raised an eyebrow. "There's talk," she continued, "about setting up a small rescue. Something different. A place not just for abandoned dogs, but for retired service animals. Ones that need time, understanding." Walt said nothing. "We call it something quiet," she added quickly. "Nothing fancy. Just a name and a cabin, and a field out back where they can walk without being watched." Walt considered her. "And you want to hear?" "Well, yes. People trust you now. And let's be honest." She glanced at Titan, who lay curled at the edge of the porch. "He's already the face of the whole thing." Walt smiled. "Just a little. You have a name?" She looked down at her clipboard, the listening field. Walt's smile deepened, still faint but real. He nodded once. "Then we'd better get started." Over the next month, the cabin changed. Not drastically. Just enough. A few repairs here. A new bench near the trail. A tin box nailed to the gate with brochures no one ever took, but always appreciated. People came, quietly, with their stories folded in their pockets. Veterans, widows, strangers who had once known what it was to be forgotten. They didn't stay long. Just enough to sit in the stillness and let something inside them shift. Titan greeted them all. He was never loud, never showy. But when he walked beside them, just once, down the edge of the woods and back, they said it felt like being remembered. Walt didn't talk much. He didn't need to. He just sat on the porch, tea in hand, the wind brushing through the trees, and watched Titan walk where James used to. Sometimes, in the late afternoons, he'd swear he heard both their footsteps. He never turned around. He didn't have to. They had returned. And so had he. Spring didn't announce itself loudly in the hills of Montana. It arrived gently, through the soft drip of melting snow from the cabin's tin roof, the return of birdsong at dawn, and the subtle way sunlight lingered a little longer each afternoon. The forest, once blanketed in silence and white, now whispered green again. Titan had begun to slow down, not in pain, just a natural quieting of a life long lived. His steps were shorter, his eyes clouded slightly with age, and he rested more during the day, often curling beneath the front porch where the light struck just right. His ears still perked at the sound of Walt's boots on wood, but he no longer rose each time. Walt Henley noticed. He didn't speak of it to anyone, but each morning he walked a little slower beside Titan, matching the dog's rhythm, not his own. They still took the trail behind the cabin when the weather allowed, though they no longer ventured far. At the bend in the path, where Titan had once turned back during the blizzard to lead Walt home, they always paused, and Walt would murmur, "We made it through, didn't we?" Titan never answered, but his tail would thump once against the earth, soft as a heartbeat. In town, people had begun to whisper that Titan was fading. No one said it unkindly. In fact, they visited more often, bringing food or letters or just sitting on the porch a while. Children came to pet him, laying down beside his aging body as if he were a warm patch of sun. Some called him a hero. Others simply called him the quiet dog who saved people. But Walt never used those words. To him, Titan was not a hero. He was a companion, a bridge, a message. One golden afternoon, Walt laid out a blanket on the porch, one that had once belonged to his late wife, and Titan came to rest on it without a word. Walt poured tea into 2 cups out of habit, placing one beside the dog, even if it went untouched. Then he sat. They watched the field together, where young rescue dogs ran in wide loops, chasing scents and swallows. "You see them," Walt said softly. "They don't even know they're starting over." Titan didn't move, but his ear twitched. That was the last week Titan walked farther than the porch. By the following Tuesday, he spent most of his time lying quietly in the same spot, under the shade of the maple tree, where the wind carried the scent of pine and memory. Walt made a bed there for him, an old wool blanket folded thick, a silver bowl beside it filled with water, and a leather toy that had long lost its shape. In the mornings, Walt would sit with him. In the evenings, he'd do the same. And one morning, with the skies still lavender and the mist hanging low across the field, Titan didn't get up. Walt crouched beside him, feeling the old ache in his knees. He placed one hand on Titan's ribcage, just to be sure. He was still breathing, but slowly, and then not at all. No struggle, no sound, just peace. As if the earth had whispered, "It's time," and Titan simply obeyed. Walt stayed beside him for a long time. He didn't cry, not at first. He just sat, his hand resting gently on the dog's shoulder. The air smelled like wet grass and old wood. A sparrow sang from somewhere near the barn. Eventually, he rose, went into the house, took down his son's old uniform jacket, the one folded tight in the cedar chest, and carefully wrapped Titan in it. He dug the grave himself, though it took most of the day, and his back howled in protest. He chose a spot beneath the maple tree, where the porch light reached at night, and above it, he placed a small wooden marker. "Titan, my last friend, the one who brought my son home." He didn't host a ceremony, but for a week after, people came anyway, not with flowers, with stories. A man from town brought a photo of his daughter, one of the kids Titan had helped find during the storm. A woman brought an old leash from a dog long gone. A child barely 8 left a drawing of Walt and Titan sitting under a tree, both looking out at a sky full of stars. Walt accepted them all with a quiet nod, but he said little, because some goodbyes didn't require words. In the mornings after, he still opened the front door and poured 2 cups of tea. He placed one next to Titan's collar, now resting on the porch bench beside his knit cap. The tea would steam into the morning air, untouched. People asked if he'd get another dog. Walt shook his head. "Titan wasn't just a dog," he said once. "He was a silence that understood me." On a late spring evening, long after the last snow melted and the fields turned soft with green, a boy returned to visit, now nearly a teenager. He had been the smallest child rescued that night in the blizzard. In his hand, he held a leather-bound sketchbook. "I drew him," he said, flipping through pages. He showed Walt a picture of Titan walking beside James, Walt's son, both looking out over a field, the sun rising behind them. Walt traced the sketch with one finger. "They're still together," the boy whispered. Walt smiled faintly. They never left. And that night, when the sun sank low over the listening field, casting long shadows across the grass and warming the cabin walls with lavender and amber light, Walt sat quietly on the porch. His hands rested on his knees. His tea cooled beside him. And if you'd been there just then, you might have sworn you heard footsteps. 4 of them, pacing softly in the grass beside him. But Walt didn't look up. He didn't need to. Some companions never leave. They just walk beside us, silently always,